And good morning, and thank you for all your interest. Yeah, I'm one of those people who would get up early to come and talk about evaluation with people, because I know just how important doing good impact evaluation, managing good impact evaluation is for UNICEF's work. And so I'm very, very pleased to get up early and be with you today. So let's just get the technical bits working. So Nicola, is that working okay in terms of sound? And
so I can hear you fine. If anyone cannot hear, please let us know in the column. But you might want to click on Take Over Us Presenter so that we,
Okay, good.
And we can see the PowerPoint now, so great.
Oh, that's good. It was giving me a very problematic message saying it couldn't be uploaded, but now there it is. So just take a sip of water. Good.
Okay, so I can see the PowerPoint. If anyone else cannot see it, please also let us know. But over to you, Patricia.
Terrific, thank you. So yes, this webinar is looking at both the collection of data and the analysis of it, and it's drawn from Kate Piersman's brief that she wrote with terrific input from the UNICEF Advisory Board on data collection and analysis methods. It's one of the topics that obviously you first think about, well, how am I going to get the data to answer these questions? And it's placed within a context of the 13 other briefs. And I just wanted to just locate that just so you can understand where you might go for some other information. The last webinar that we did, we provided the overview to it all, and you'll see that we've got the briefs organised in terms of these sort of three clusters. So at the bottom there are these fundamental elements of impact evaluation that really need to be addressed before you get to the methods. So one is talking about theories of change, which we'll have a separate webinar on later. One on the criteria that the evaluation is based on. Another on evaluative reasoning. How do we bring together the values in an evaluation and the evidence to form an overall judgment? So that's really thinking through that process. And then participatory methods, not just collecting data from people, but actually involving people in the process of the evaluation and the decision making about the evaluation. So we'll talk about that at another stage as well. In the middle, we have ways of dealing with the causal inference. How do we know that it was the project or program that helped to bring about these results that we're interested in? So we have an overview one. We have a brief on randomised control trials that have a control group. We have one on quasi-experimental approaches that use different types of comparison groups. And we have one on a particular type of non-experimental way of doing causal inference, which is through comparative case studies. And then the top line is the focus really for today, where we have different ways of collecting the data and analysing it. And particularly we have three that look at particular methods. One is looking at measures of child wellbeing, which obviously is of major importance for many UNICEF evaluations, so it looks specifically at that. One which looks at interviewing, which is part of just about every evaluation and can often be done well, so this looks at some ways to do that better, and then ways of looking at modelling. So just to sort of locate where this webinar is. But before we go on, I'd like to hear from you, and particularly to understand where you're located in terms of your experience. So could you tell us, in your experience, how are the decisions usually made about data collection and analysis methods for an evaluation? So these are meant to be numbered, so let me just say, I don't think I can fix that. So number one, and Nicola will be putting this up as a poll. So number one, are they set out in the terms of reference? And that's pretty much it. They pretty much stay the same. And those terms of reference might be developed by the UNICEF Evaluation Manager or a steering committee, or it might be done in conjunction with your partners. but they're really set out in the terms of reference and that's it? Or does the evaluation team read that terms of reference and then in their proposal come back with some suggested variation on that? That's 2. Number 3, do you actually ask the evaluation team to recommend methods in their proposal so that the terms of reference says what questions you want answered and what data you currently have, but you actually ask the evaluation teams to propose methods? Or does that decision come later, where the evaluation team accepts the terms of reference, you accept their proposal, but with the expectation that at the inception report it would be reviewed once they've had a chance to really look at the data and look at how feasible that's going to be? Or, given that we're particularly focused on impact evaluation, is there a separate project before the evaluation that designs that evaluation? So, now, Nicola, here we go. Well done.
We've just put up the poll. So for those of you online, if you'd just like to vote to let us know what typically happens in your context. And if none of those apply, also let us know in the comments something else that you might do. Okay, so Patricia, so we have 11 responses, and by large are now 12, but nevertheless, evaluation team recommends methods in their proposal is the leading one. In 25% of the cases, the UNICEF evaluation manager or steering committee defines them in the TOR. Oh, it's going up, 31.
Yeah,
it's a tie between that and actually having the evaluators propose it. But as you can see, in none of the cases there is a separate design project before the evaluation, which is interesting. And in some cases there is, oh, hang on, we've got 8% saying yes now. Some revisions in the inception report and also in the proposal. So I'll stop presenting and you can take over as presenter now again.
Thanks very much for setting that up. That's really fascinating, and I think very helpful to have those different scenarios in mind as we talk about data collection and analysis, because this webinar is not about being an evaluator and doing proposals. It's about being the evaluation manager or the part of this steering committee. And being in those different scenarios, so that it might be that you are going to set these out in a terms of reference, and so you really need to be able to think about how to go about choosing those methods to put into the terms of reference, whether or not they'll be revised at the proposal stage or in the inception report. So how do you first draw that up? Then, if the evaluators are going to come back with some suggested revisions, how do you respond to that? How do you make sense of their alternative suggestions and be able to tell what's a good suggestion and what's not? If they're proposing methods, then you might get proposals that look really very different. And so how do you trade those off? And then the other really important scenario is whatever the decision is, you then have the role about making sure this is done well. And how do you provide that oversight? So that's really the different scenarios that this is intended to inform. And I hope that you have some particular questions that relate to that. And so the brief really takes you through a series of topics. And for this webinar, what we've done is to really look at 7 principles for doing that. That might be helpful. So let's get started on those. And so the first one is to really focus on the different types of questions that you have in the key evaluation questions. Now, when we talk about key evaluation questions, it's not about the questions in an interview schedule. It's the sort of 5 or 7 very high-level questions that the evaluation is designed to answer. And even in an impact evaluation, there'll be a range of questions in order to make sense of the questions about impact. So what I have found enormously helpful for me when thinking about methods for evaluation is to be really clear about the types of questions, and many organisations categorise different types of questions that sort of are behind your key evaluation questions. Sometimes different labels are used, but the concepts I think are critically important. So the first set are what we might call normative questions, about the way things ought to be. They're about the values that underpin the program and that should underpin the evaluation. So they might be values about what sort of impacts are desirable, what sort of processes are desirable, what sort of distribution of costs and benefits is desirable. So UNICEF has a very clear, explicit equity focus. Well, that's a normative value about the way things should be. And that means that you're not just going to be interested in the average effect. You're going to be particularly interested in what's happening for the most disadvantaged. So normative questions are often implied in an evaluation question, and how you go about answering those is quite different. I mean, the values of UNICEF are not going to come from just doing an interview with people. They're going to come from stated statements about the values. They're going to come from the values for the organisation and for the project and for your partners about what it is that you value. So the second group are looking at descriptive questions, and this is pretty much the focus of today's webinar. They're factual questions about what has happened, what are things like, and you have to be able to answer those questions before you can answer the other ones. So you might be interested in what were the conditions like before and after the program or the policy. So before we can get to the impacts and whether the program's made a difference, we need to describe how were things beforehand, how are things afterwards, what changes have there been, what changes have occurred that were intended and what changes were unintended, because we want to make sure we look at all of those. What happened during implementation and what activities were done and how were they done, getting really good descriptions of the quantity of services or the quantity of activities, but also their quality. And then what was the context in which it was undertaken, really understanding the political, environmental, geographic, social context, which is then going to have an influence on the impacts. And this is where doing a really good theory of change will tell you what are the things we need to understand, what are the things we need to have answers to descriptive questions. So the third set of questions are the causal questions. Now we know that something happened in our activities, we know that something changed. The causal questions say, was there a connection between the two? What produced these changes that we've seen? To what extent were they due to the program or the project? What other factors contributed? And overall, what were the impacts of the program or the project? And that's where that second row in our briefs is all about strategies to answer those causal questions. But of course, the evaluations themselves have to start with answering normative questions and descriptive questions. And then the fourth group is looking at evaluative questions. And this is where you do that synthesis of the values and the evidence to form these overall judgments. Was the implementation good quality? Was the program or the project effective? What was its quality? Was it good, taking into account the intended and unintended impacts? And that's when you might then do some comparisons. Is it the best option? Is it better than some alternatives? And was it worthwhile? Was it cost effective? Was it value for money? These are evaluative questions where you need to combine what happened, what the contribution of the program was, and what the resources were. And overall, was it any good? Right, I need to take over present now. I'm so sorry. Okay. Let me just load up this file again. Nicola, thank you for the message. We can see the screen, but now I can't present it. That's very problematic. I can't move it. Ah, there we go. Good. Okay, so thinking about those different categories, when we then see one of your key evaluation questions, which might be something about how effective was it, you can see to answer that, you have to actually answer these different types of questions. So to be talking about how effective was it, you have to say, well, what would be a desirable result? That's your normative question. You have to have a descriptive question about, well, to what extent were these achieved? You need a causal question linking those results to your program, and then you need an evaluative question about what level of success does this represent, and it's, you know, did we meet our target, and how does that balance out with perhaps some unintended effects that might have not been positive. So that's the starting point. It's extremely important to think about the types of questions, and I found this one way of thinking about it is one of the most helpful ways to think about different types of data and different types of parts of your methodology to answer these different questions. And I think if you sort of have this in mind when you're discussing evaluations with people, it'll help enormously, because people often they want to just focus on the description, or they just want to focus on the causal questions, and it's about both. So separating them out really helps those conversations. So that's the first bit of advice. The second one is to then map your possible data sources across the key evaluation questions and use a complementary mix of methods. So this is an image from the video about data collection and analysis that accompanies the brief, and you'll see that it's got some key evaluation questions. What was the quality of implementation? To what extent were the program objectives met? What other impacts did the program have, and how could the program be improved? Now this is looking at how you would then get some data to answer those. Clearly, for the causal question, you'd also need to have a strategy for causal inference for that. And one of the important things in this matrix is to see, do we have where possible, multiple ticks in a row, so that we're not relying on a single source to answer this question, but we're trying to triangulate. And so that the point of the triangulation is that the weaknesses of any one method get balanced out by the strengths of another. So it's not just about saying, well, we've triangulated because we have two different types of data here. It's about saying, what are the weaknesses of that first one, and are they balanced by the strengths of the second one? What are the blind spots that we might have from that first one? What are the biases that we might have, and will adding that second one just reinforce those biases, or will it actually shine a bit of a light on those blind spots? So here's an example from one of the impact evaluations of cash and food transfers, where they had a range of information around child assessment. They had some direct measurement, they did some tests, they did some anthropometry, they tested for anemia, and then they had some sampling about who they tested for that. They did a questionnaire with the caregiver for each of the centres, the early childhood centres, and then they had a community questionnaire. So, you know, you have a range of data that's filling in the different pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to understand. Here's another example from another cash transfer one, where they had both qualitative data and quantitative data, and it's very often helpful to have both of those in your design. So they had some interviews. They had some in-depth interviews with some key informants, some focus groups with children and other stakeholders. They did observations using photographs, so they had some before and after. And clearly with any of these, whether it's interviews or photographs, you need to make sure the ethical consent's been obtained and that the ethical use of those has been ensured. And then they had a quantitative survey where they developed a special survey for the project, but they based it on some previous data collection tools that had been developed. But one of the observations that I've made in terms of looking at a lot of impact evaluations in general and evaluations generally is that we often use a narrow range of methods. People think about interviews, they think about project records, and there are a wider range of methods. So one of the areas that might be relevant is just using mobile data collection when you're doing interviews and questionnaires. There's been a huge explosion in the use of these, and they're just really transforming both the quality and the speed in which this can be done. You actually get better error checking, you get better quality data, and you turn around the data analysis a lot faster. So there's been a real explosion of these use, and this might be something that would make a big difference to the quality of the data that you get. One of the types of data that's not so commonly used is looking at big data, which might be collecting data from websites or from social media, or in this case tracking actual electricity distribution. The UN Global Pulse is doing some very interesting work around this, really experimenting on what's possible to do and what's useful to do. This is an example on estimating poverty levels in Côte d'Ivoire. And the challenge here is that doing it the traditional way is very expensive and time-consuming and can only be done infrequently because of the cost. So they did an experiment about using the electricity distribution as an indicator about the poverty, and mapped that, and were able to get down to much smaller regions so that they could have a much more granular estimate of the poverty, and they could go in and actually check that, how accurate that was, with some spot checks on it. So there's some really interesting work going on in big data, and that might be something that evaluators might suggest or you might investigate if you're drawing up a terms of reference. There's also some fantastic work going on in decentralised data gathering. So it's not so much your evaluation team going out with a clipboard or a mobile phone to collect data, but drawing on data from a range of people who are already out in the field. This is an example that's looking at the polio, reports of polio in Syria. Clearly there's massive difficulties in going out into the field. So they were collecting data through a variety of means: text messages, email, Twitter and web forms to do mapping around it. This is another study on decentralised data gathering that was looking at the drugs that were available in health clinics, particularly sort of first-line treatment drugs. And so they actually had sent a team out, but they were able to report that on this map, and you could actually zoom down and see where the problems are. You can do community mapping, where you actually go out and plot where resources are. So this is in Kibera, just in Nairobi, in Kenya, and it was people actually walking the ground with a GPS and mapping where facilities are, where the latrines are, where there's access to water. And if you want more, this is some of the methods that are on the BetterEvaluation website, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read it. I'm just making the point that there are lots and lots of methods. And we should be more thoughtful about a wider range of options. Clearly you also need an evaluation team who can implement the methods properly, but we should think more widely about what what methods we can put in place. If you go to the BetterEvaluation website, you can and look in Describe, it'll take you down and give you information about all those methods. So there is information out there and examples. So spend a bit of time just becoming aware of some options and ideally get some technical input about which ones might be viable. When we're looking at these complementary methods, look at some ways of combining the qual and the quant data, the qualitative data, words and pictures and sounds, and the quantitative data that's in numbers. In the video, we've really shown them as sort of strands that come together to make the whole thing stronger. And I think increasingly people are seeing that most good evaluations really need to have elements of both, and to think how to combine those. I have seen evaluations where you've had a qualitative team and a quantitative team, and they work independently, and at the end of the study they write separate chapters, and it's a terrible waste. It's just not the way to do it. You have to be linking them and combining them throughout, and you might be doing them in parallel, or you might do them in sequence where you do some quant and then some qual, or vice versa. So in the brief we've talked about 4 different strategies. One is that you enrich your understanding. So you might identify some issues in your quantitative data, like in a survey, and then you use qualitative data to get a better understanding. Like you might then do some interviews with people who exemplify some of the patterns, and then you actually understand more what's going on. You might use it to examine, where you might start with some interviews or some observations or some review of project records, develop some hypotheses, and then you'll test those with some quantitative data. Or you might use them to explain. You might have found your patterns in your quantitative data and you say, why is that there? And so you go and do some qualitative interviews, not just to elaborate it, but to really get to the bottom of the mystery. Why is that going on? Why did this group not participate, for example? And you can also use it to triangulate, where you actually verify or challenge the results from one set of data to the other. So these are questions to really ask your consultants. Right? Don't let them just get away with saying we'll have a mixed methods approach, or we'll use qualitative and quantitative. Ask how they're going to combine them, how they're really going to get the strengths out of both of them. There are some particular issues, obviously, in collecting data from children, and some terrific work that's going on. This is some guidance on examining climate change and environmental education, and looking at some ways of collecting data from children about the impacts of those programs. So you can do things like mapping with them, or you can do a community tour to look at what's happening in their community, doing some observation and some recording about that. You can get item rating and annotated drawings, and of course you can have focus groups and discuss with them. There are other methods like democracy, where you actually get to vote on different statements, and it's again very interactive. It means that they all can have a voice in doing that, and there's information about that on the BetterEvaluation website. We've also we collaborated with the community of evaluators to run a webinar, particularly on children and evaluation, and that's now on YouTube, and they have lots of terrific examples about working with children. So sometimes they're a source of data, and so you're getting their views on things. Sometimes they're the ones actually collecting the data, and we'll talk a bit more about this when we look at participatory methods. And so this is just a still from that webinar, showing the children both collecting data, analysing it, and then presenting it. And so the third recommendation is to make sure that you make maximum possible use of the existing data and measures and indicators, providing it's of adequate quality, of course. This shows them sitting about in boxes. Sometimes they're more like, they might still be in boxes, they might be in cupboards, they might be sitting on computers somewhere, but to really try to build as much use of what's already there. And obviously, if the monitoring data has been good quality, it makes an impact evaluation much better. And increasingly, people are realising that you need to plan for an impact evaluation from the start. You need to make sure that the monitoring data is helping, not just with program performance and management, but also laying the foundation for the impact evaluation. But even if that hasn't been planned, really go in and see what's there. I see too many evaluation designs that assume you have no information. So your first step in that is this evaluability assessment to say, you know, what's the data that we have? What can we build on? And let's focus our resources on, first of all, checking the quality of that, triangulating, but then filling in the gaps, not just endless duplication. So the other area to really build on what's been done before is about using existing measures where they're appropriate. So this example from Pakistan used a particular scale of infant and toddler development rather than developing it. And then classic Z scores about height for age, weight for age, and weight for height. And if a scale is appropriate to use, obviously it's better to use that than use something that's got doubtful validity or can't be compared or is going to take a lot of time to develop. And so there's a particular brief that looks especially measures of child wellbeing, and it talks about some existing scales, and it talks about using existing data where possible. Fourth recommendation is to be really focused on sampling. The sampling could be about which regions or communities you look at, or which sites. If you're looking across a whole program, it might be which projects do we look at, which events, which time periods, which clients or intended beneficiaries, and which staff. So if you're going to interview people, who are you going to speak with? If you're going to look at some cases, which ones are you going to look at? If you're going to go back through records, which time period? And to be really, really careful about this. And to think about the three different clusters of sampling strategies and which is going to be most appropriate. So the probability samples is where you there's some random chance of being selected for it. That's this first one here. They're sort of picked out randomly. The purposive ones is where we have a theoretical reason of why we want to look at those in particular, and where possible avoid the convenience ones where you talk to the people who want to talk to you. You visit the projects that are close to the main office. Think really carefully about bringing in appropriate purposive sampling, where you'll look at a critical case, or you'll make sure you've got maximum variation, or you look at confirming and disconfirming. If you have a theory, if the data is starting to suggest that these projects are only successful in particular contexts, you might really want to go and find some disconfirming ones. Show me a project that was not in that context but still succeeded. Go and have a look there. Try and work out what they did differently. Or find one that was in that favourable context and didn't work. What can you understand there? So this sampling might be in relation to actually going and doing some interviews, or it might be in terms of pulling out the records about that. I did an evaluation across over 600 projects, and we did this explicitly, that as we looked across the 600, we'd see some patterns, and then we'd say, what are some that fit that pattern? And we can use those as illustrations and to understand what's going on. And we'd pick out all those that didn't fit the pattern, and we'd try and understand what was going on there. So these are the sorts of things that your terms of reference should talk about, and your evaluators should be on top of. You need to make sure that throughout all of this, the ethical issues are both anticipated and addressed. Many of the ethical issues that you would expect to come up, you should be able to anticipate, and there's a terrific site available for you on looking at these ethical issues. And in the brief, we walk through some examples from the child-friendly schools about actually what they did to make sure that there was not an excessive response burden on the informants, that they gave informed consent, and that the anonymity of the informants was protected. So different evaluations will have different ethical issues, and there's some terrific resources in that, and this has got to be explicit about the understanding, and also making sure that these are actually carried out. I once had my briefcase stolen from my car, and the whole issue about the security of questionnaires was called into question. So it's not just what's in the design, but are people actually keeping things in a locked filing cabinet? Are they not recording names on the front page of their interview schedule? Are they using coded names? If this is what they've promised, are they actually delivering on it? Throughout all of this, we need to pay attention to the data quality, particularly if you're using existing data. You really need to test that beforehand, but also if you're collecting it. And the one thing I'd ask you particularly to pay attention to is response rates. The overall response rate, and then checking who is answering. Far too many evaluations have really, really low return rates on questionnaires, or they rely on volunteer samples, and then they draw conclusions that really are not valid. And then think about your analysis. Think about your analysis right from the beginning. And think about it in terms of the key evaluation questions. Michael Patton has an approach that he calls data rehearsal, where before you collect the data, you actually imagine the report. You can actually draft up some sample tables and conclusions. And it's a really good way of identifying gaps in the data while you still have a chance to fill them. When you're reporting, make sure that the evaluation team reports in terms of the key evaluation questions. They need to be doing a synthesis of all the data, not reporting item by item on the questionnaire, and making sure they go beyond the average effect in terms of both understanding what's going on and also exploring equity issues. So we've talked at the beginning about these different ways of how you decide these data collection and analysis methods, whether they're set out in the terms of reference or they're negotiated in the inception report, or it actually is a separate study. If you're doing a big study, really consider if that's an option. The technical and logistic issues that have to be negotiated is a lot of work, and it might well be an appropriate way to go about it to actually commission the design as a separate piece of work. And it might be that the groups who do the design are not the best ones to implement it. So really consider that as an option. And there's more resources from the Office for Research, 4 different briefs that you can look at. But I'm going to stop there. That'll give us 20 minutes for questions.